Readers, listeners, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I really hope that all of you have loved this deep dive into Franny and Zooey and Perfect Day for Banana Fish. It has been so gratifying to take a deeper look at someone who we all read in high school, and many of us go on to really love Salinger and to keep up with his work, but it is always so gratifying to go back and look at why, in fact, this prose is so unbelievable. One reader wrote to ask why we were reading Franny and Zooey and not some of the other work. And part of that is because revisiting Catcher in the Rye, while that sounds like a great idea, was a little less interesting to me, in part because of the adolescent focus and because of the male focus, although I would like to go back and take a look at all of that. I really like Franny and Zooey because there is in some ways a young woman at the center, which is somewhat unusual for the longer pieces of Salinger. I also, for whatever reason, have a real soft spot in my heart for Franny and Zooey. I really also love Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters and Seymour in Introduction, but that is a collection of two novellas that is actually more flawed in some ways than Franny and Zooey, and I really wanted to dive into this one because in some ways I do think the structure and certainly the prose are sort of paragons of what it is that Salinger was trying to do. So, for those of you who like an agenda, today we're going to do an ultra brief recap of the bio and the publishing history of Salinger. This, for some of you, will be the third time you've heard it. I will zip through that quickly. We're then going to talk about the structure of this book-length piece of fiction, and then also of the novella Zooey itself. So we're going to be diving a little more heavily into Zooey because we already did our big deep dive on Franny. Speaking of which, if you are tuning in for the first time today, that is great. But be apprised that, in fact, we did a deep dive on Franny and a deep dive on A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, both of which are crucial in terms of really understanding Franny and Zooey as a whole. We're then going to dive in. We're going to take a very quick look at the beginning of Franny, the ending of Franny, and then a couple of key moments in Zooey. We're then going to move on to the religious crisis that is at the center of Zooey, and in some ways is at the center of Franny. We're going to look at it relatively in depth. And in our deep dive into this crisis, we're also going to take a close look at Salinger's prose. We are then going to finish up with the enduring appeal and the charm of this book, what it is that makes it still such a favorite. We're going to dive back in now with a very quick biography and publishing history. Jerome David Salinger was born on January 1st, 1919. He died in 2010 in New Hampshire. I must admit that Salinger, very much like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and even Alice Munro, these were writers who, when their deaths were announced, I was a little bit like, wow, wait, I actually thought that that person died a long time ago. That is not to say that my love for these people was any diminished, but I just kind of, lost track of them a little bit. In 1944, very importantly, he was drafted into the Second World War. He saw three of the huge battles, the Battle of Utah Beach, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Battle of Hurtgen. I think that's how you say it. But perhaps more importantly, he was part of a denazification effort that meant the liberation of part of Dachau. This was obviously a very traumatic thing. He is someone who grew up Jewish. His father was Jewish. His mother was of Scottish descent, but really adhered to the Jewish faith. And in fact, Salinger did not know that his mother was not Jewish until after his bar mitzvah. So this is someone who was Jewish, grew up in New York. And so you can imagine that the liberation of this concentration camp for anyone, let alone someone of the Jewish faith, that this would be a very, very traumatic event. His daughter, in fact, quotes him, hearkening back to the traumatic moments of that denazification effort. In 1946, he was given an honorable discharge from the Army. In that same year, he published his first story in The New Yorker, which was Slight Rebellion off of Madison. So many of you know that that is kind of the germ that led, in fact, to Catcher in the Rye. He did come home from the war in 1946 with someone that he had married. Her name was Sylvia. That marriage was not fated to last, only lasted for 8 months. In 1948, he published A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, also in The New Yorker. In 1951, he published Catcher in the Rye, which is really known as his sort of magnum opus. It was something that was very popular at the time, really put him on the map, and in fact left not only the publishers, in fact, but all of the reading public really wanting more novel-length work. After Catcher in the Rye, he publishes 9 stories, which was obviously a collection of his stories. In 1955, he publishes Franny as a short story in the New Yorker. In 1957, he publishes Zoe. In 1961, because of some of this pressure of wanting a book length manuscript, he publishes Franny and Zooey, which was another book length piece of fiction. The reason I keep seeing book length piece of fiction is because that is what it says on my jacket copy. I never know what to call Franny and Zooey because it is not, in fact, a novel. Neither is Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters and Seymour an Introduction, which is another book length piece of fiction. So I think it's actually very cagey and smart, in fact, of these publishers to talk about these book length works of fiction because they are not novels. And I think for a lot of people, that's a detractor. This idea that there isn't a through line, there isn't a cohesive plot. For someone like me, who is less invested in plot and is kind of interested in, the limitations of the novel and in how we can play with the form of the novel, I love this departure from a straightforward novelistic narrative. We're going to talk about the structure. What we have here, particularly in Franny and Zooey, and also, in fact, in Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters and Seymour an Introduction, we have, these two shorter pieces of fiction mushed together. So in the case of Franny and Zooey, which is our focus today, we have Franny, which is a 40-page, in my edition, a 40-page short story that was published in the New Yorker as a short story, together with Zooey, which is a significantly longer, 120 pages, 140 pages. It's a novella that was also published in the New Yorker. What I like about the two of them mushed together is, they're published 2 years apart, but what I love about them mushed together is the way that you can see the resonance between the two of them. You can see the different sort of, seeds that were planted in Franny and even seeds that were planted in Banana Fish and how they grow and how they inflect Zooey, which gives us a much richer lens through which to look back at both Banana Fish and Franny. So very quickly, Banana Fish is 48, Franny is 55, and Zooey is 57. Then Franny and Zooey is 61. The reason why I keep mentioning Banana Fish, for those of you who didn't listen to the second lecture, is because A Perfect Day for Banana Fish introduces us to Seymour Glass and, in fact, speaks of his suicide. And that suicide is incredibly important for all of the Glass family, but certainly is important for the youngest Glasses, Franny and Zooey. So in Banana Fish, we see a first chunk of the short story that very closely follows Muriel, and then a second part that very closely follows Seymour. So you have first this, narrative by a young woman, followed by a narrative closely following a young man. The same thing happens in Franny and Zooey. Franny's story, obviously, is following very closely the story of Franny Glass, and then the second part of that book-length manuscript is in fact following Zooey. It has a lot to do with Franny, obviously, but it really is a deep dive into what is happening with Zooey Glass. So you have this hybrid, this two-part structure in Banana Fish, and then you see it again in Franny and Zooey. But what's also interesting is that you in fact see something very similar in Zooey itself. In Zooey, we have a beginning narration on the part of Buddy Glass, a preface-ish thing, which we're going to look at. And then we have Zooey, who is in the bath, who is reading a letter from Buddy, which of course should echo a bit the idea of Lane standing on the platform reading the letter from Franny. So in the beginning of Zooey, we have Zooey in the bathtub reading a letter. And then we switch at some point and we have Zooey and Franny together. Franny is having her crisis in the living room and Zooey is becoming very involved in a dialogue with her, which is essentially the last part. So in each of these, we have Muriel and then Seymour, and then we have Franny and Zooey. But even within Zooey, we have this long first part that has to do with Zooey, and then a last part that has to do with Franny and Zooey. So when we are looking at things like structure, or actually any part of any piece of literature, whether it's the narrative stance or it's symbolism or figurative language of any sort, it's important to note the thing, of course, but then it's even better to ask yourself, so what? So why is it that we see over and over and over these kind of divided parts in Salinger? I mean, partly it's a practical thing in that he, definitely was more of a short story writer than things of novel length. But also, I really think that we can read into this, we have these kind of solitary stories of these kind of solitary characters. I think there is a lot in Salinger about not knowing another person and about failing to connect with another person. There is a lot of connection, but even within the connection, there's a lot of failure to communicate. There's a lot of failure. We see, for example, in Banana Fish, Muriel is very much by herself, and Seymour is with Sybil, but his primary relationship, which should have been with Muriel, or perhaps with his siblings, is definitely not brought to the fore in that seminal work. Same thing with Franny. We have her not really connecting with Lane, even though they are supposed to be partners. And then we have this idea of Zooey as, in fact, having a crisis of his own while he is in the bathtub, not quite connecting with Buddy and not quite connecting with his mother. And then we do actually, I think, have a very nice connection between Franny and Zooey. In Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters, we have Buddy essentially by himself in that first part. So there's a lot of sort of siloing of these different characters in their own stories. And I think that should speak to us of the human condition, which is not only that we are all fated to die, but essentially that we are independent, discrete people who, even despite, our best efforts, are not really able to be wholly known by anyone else. This sounds very dark, and in fact, it is very dark, but of course, everything in Salinger is leavened to a certain degree by his incredible prose. We're not going to dig too deeply into the prose because we certainly did that with Franny, but I will say that the spareness of it, together with this kind of hyperbolic quality with all the adverbs and all of the extreme, everything, terribly and absolutely and marvelous and all of the other adverbs and adjectives, but together with this very stripped down, very stage direction like prose, does in fact add some sort of humor and some sort of levity to themes that are in fact very dark. I also want to make quick note of the narrative stance and the way that it shifts from 1948 when we see Banana Fish to 1955 with Franny and to 1957 with Zooey. So in A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, you can argue that all of these stories are told by Buddy Glass, and that Buddy Glass is essentially this kind of omniscient narrator who is even telling us the story of Muriel in the hotel room and Seymour's death. But that narrator is in fact a very removed narrator who, is getting close at some times to Seymour, but for the most part is very, very far. It's as if the camera is pulled way back, and this narrator is simply reporting what it is that Muriel is doing and the conversation between Sybil and Seymour. All of this is simply reported to us. And the reader actually has to work quite hard to understand the crisis that Seymour is undergoing, all of which is very important, of course, because the story culminates, in fact, with him taking his life. In Franny, we have this same third-person narrator, but it's a little more nimble. There are times when that narrator, in 1955, really enters into the consciousness of Lane Coutel and of Franny Glass. And in fact, sometimes that narrator takes on, in a very chameleon-like way, the language and the syntax of the different people, be it Lane, where there's a lot of goddamn this and goddamn that, or Franny herself. And then, interestingly, 2 years later in 1957, we have this first-person narrator who steps in at the beginning of Zooey, and in fact, this is Buddy Glass. So we have this idea of Buddy Glass as essentially sort of taking the stage and saying that he is the one who has been telling the stories of the Glass family. So we have this first-person narrator, and then we have the narrator moving away in the second part when we have Zooey interacting more with his sister, Franny, but it is still a narrator that's a bit closer. So I would argue that over the course of these years from 1948 to 1957, we have this kind of movement of the narrator from being a very, very sort of pulled back, very spare, almost detached narrator to one that is much more involved and in fact takes on this first-person guise in the shape of Buddy Glass. We're now going to dive into the text. Oh my God. For those of you on YouTube, if I look like I just woke up, I just am noticing how I look like I just woke up because I just put my glasses on. For those of you who are on the YouTube, if it looks like I just woke up, that's because I did. I just woke up. It's very early in the morning. I'm actually trying to be a little bit quiet because everyone else in this house is sleeping. So we're going to dive into the text. We're going to take a very quick look at a couple of elements of Franny, and then we are going to take a somewhat longer look at some of the important shifts and some of the important sections of Zooey. This is now going to feel somewhat familiar to some of you. This is the very opening of Franny. Though brilliantly sunny, Saturday morning was overcoat weather again. Not just topcoat weather, as it had been all week, and as everyone had hoped it would stay for the big weekend, the weekend of the Yale game. Okay, so here we have our omniscient narrator sort of setting up from a certain distance the space into which Lane and Franny will enter. We are now going to jump all the way to the end of Franny, a mere 40 pages later. We have this final brief paragraph. Alone, Franny lay quite still, looking at the ceiling. Her lips began to move, forming soundless words, and they continued to move. So at the end of Franny, it's the beginning of her religious crisis where she is really devoting herself to the Jesus prayer. And of course, this is what will occasion our introduction to Zooey in the novella 2 years later. Significantly, of course, the novella is called Zooey. I think it is really interesting and very satisfying, in fact, that we have these nicknames for these two youngest Glass children, Franny Glass and Zooey Glass. I really love the fact that Salinger, in true kind of stripped down and nicknamey mode, named the short story and the novella simply the nicknames of the two kids. And then, kids, I keep saying kids, they're in their young 20s. Then when he decided to come out with the book-length piece of fiction, we in fact just mushed those two together, Franny and Zooey. I'm just very happy that he didn't try to come up with some other title. It feels very honest in some ways, but also very satisfying. So Zooey is one of the few characters in the Glass family where we really understand his full name. Zooey is short for Zachary Martin Glass, which we find out on page 68. Importantly, he is an actor, and much is made, in fact, of his job as an actor. Anytime we have a character in a story who is really, the titular character and also someone who is the focus of the story, it's important, obviously, to look at what they do for work. It is very significant that Zachary Martin Glass is an actor. So you can imagine that, starting with Catcher in the Rye and all the phoniness that Holden Caulfield is trying to call out in the world, the idea of being an actor in some ways seems to run up against some of the values that Salinger is putting forth. These ideas of authenticity and communication and spirituality instead of, any sort of materialistic bids for glory or fame. But I think there's also a way to think of acting, and certainly the acting that Zooey is trying to do, that speaks to a certain authenticity in terms of being in the moment. So the very best actors are going to be responding in the moment to the people they are acting with. This is not someone who is sort of faking something. It is, in fact, someone who is deeply connected with the people that they are partnering with. So I think there's a way to look at acting as we look at everything in Salinger, in the sense that this is a much more complicated idea than first meets the eye. We then are going to look at the very first paragraph of Zooey. The facts at hand presumably speak for themselves, but a trifle more vulgarly, I expect, than facts even usually do. As a counterbalance, then, we begin with that ever-fresh and exciting odium, the author's formal introduction. The one I have in mind not only is wordy and earnest beyond my wildest dreams, but it is, to boot, rather excruciatingly personal. If, with the right kind of luck, it comes off, it should be comparable in effect to a compulsory guided tour through the engine room, with myself, as guide, leading the way in an old one-piece Jansen bathing suit. So we have actually some very Wes Anderson type things here. A Jansen bathing suit is one of those ones that you see in old-timey pictures. It's like a one-piece guy suit, that has kind of a tank toppy thing and little short shorts, usually black. So we have this author's introduction, and yet it is very cagey in lots of ways. We are also, importantly, invited, I think, to conflate Buddy and Salinger. Later in this, he speaks about the one novel that he published, which is about this disaffected youth, which is one of the main reasons why I think we are invited to think of Buddy as Salinger, but also the idea of an author's introduction. This is not a narrator's introduction. It is, in fact, the author. So I think, again, we are invited to look at him as Salinger. But we also have this idea right from the start that this is very personal. He says it's going to be personal. We are using the first person. I also really love that he uses the first person singular, I, but he also uses we. So we have this idea of the first person plural. So there is kind of a uniting of the reader and Buddy Glass, simply because when a narrator says we begin, it is including, in fact, the reader. It's very interesting to me that he thinks that anything personal is going to be excruciatingly personal. It is not comfortable for Buddy Glass to be personal, although, of course, all Buddy Glass does, whenever we see him in writing, is talk about things that are personal. But we have this mention in the middle of the paragraph about how this is going to be personal, and then the narrator pushes us away by having this kind of strange metaphor about how this work is going to be essentially, a trip through a machine room by someone in a bathing suit. So he's using this absurdity in order to push away the idea of something personal. And this is a lot of Salinger. There's a lot of push and pull of Salinger, which is sort of, emblematic, I think, of many of the ways that we communicate as human beings. We essentially are trying to get close to one another, and it becomes uncomfortable, and so there is, some manner of distancing. And then we're going to move on quickly and just read the first part of the second paragraph. To get straight to the worst, what I'm about to offer isn't really a short story at all, but a sort of prose home movie. And those who have seen the footage have strongly advised me against nurturing any elaborate distribution plans for it. The dissenting group, it's my privilege and headache to divulge, consists of the three featured players themselves, 2 female, 1 male. We'll take the leading lady first, who, I believe, would prefer to be briefly described as a languid, sophisticated type. So this is Franny. The other lady of the ensemble, a svelte twilight soubrette, objects to my having, so to speak, photographed her in her old housecoat. So here we have the idea of Bessie. And then a little further down, we have another show of vulnerability on the part of Buddy. He's speaking of the two of them. They know from experience that I burst into tears at the first harsh or remonstrative word. It is the leading man, however, who has made the most eloquent appeal to me to call off the production. He feels that the plot hinges on mysticism or religious mystification. In any case, he makes it very clear, a too vividly apparent transcendent element of sorts, which he says he's worried can only expedite, move up, the day and hour of my professional undoing. So very importantly, Salinger lots of times, again and again, in fact, he does it at the beginning when he equates this book to a cool lima bean. He does this thing where he's kind of trying to quit before he gets fired. So essentially, he's laying out all of the weaknesses of this novella before he's even getting started. And because we're going to look at the religious crisis in a moment, I want to read one more sentence. People are already shaking their heads over me, and any immediate further professional use on my part of the word God, except as a familiar, healthy American expletive, will be taken, or rather confirmed, as the very worst kind of name dropping and a sure sign that I'm going straight to the dogs. So we have this very important and very satisfying introduction at the beginning, especially because if you've read 9 stories and you've read Franny, and essentially you've probably also at some point have read Zooey, in the New Yorker as a novella, it's very satisfying to have this kind of recap. I also am a total sucker for this kind of meta thing where we have this introduction of an author who is also our narrator, both of which are obviously fictive. And then he's talking about, how everyone's saying, oh, don't publish this thing. There's a very, I love that. I mean, I'm very susceptible to this idea of playing with the form of sort of, breaking the fourth wall or whatever that acting term is. It is so tempting to read so much of this prose because it is so unbelievably great. I also think it's, it's nice on some level to hear these, even myself to hear these stories read aloud because in fact, they're not audio versions of them. So we have this final paragraph that I want to read very briefly here. This is essentially Buddy saying why, in fact, he believes that he should be publishing this thing. The fact is, I've been producing prose home movies off and on since I was 15. Somewhere in The Great Gatsby, which was my Tom Sawyer when I was 12, the youthful narrator remarks that everybody suspects himself of having at least one of the cardinal virtues, and he goes on to say that he thinks his, bless his heart, is honesty. Mine, I think, is that I know the difference between a mystical story and a love story. I say that my current offering isn't a mystical story or a religiously mystifying story at all. I say it's a compound or multiple love story, pure and complicated. This is unbelievably great. It is so, so good. Salinger is such a genius. So a couple of very important points here. One is that we started taking this look at Salinger in large part because we had looked at The Great Gatsby. And in my mind, there is something, because in high school we all read The Great Gatsby and we all read Catcher in the Rye. You sort of conflate those two, even though, the former was published in 1927 and this was published in 1951. And they, in fact, don't have a lot to do with each other. Although, come to think of it, that would be a very interesting thing to look at the two. They have more, just as I'm thinking through them, they have a little more in common than you might imagine. But I like this idea here of, bringing up not only The Great Gatsby as kind of a name-droppy thing, but saying, that narrator, Nick Carraway, He felt like his most salient and important trait in terms of the story was his honesty. But then we have again this vulnerability on the part of Buddy, which is that he knows the difference between a mystical story and a love story. And I really, really love the idea of looking at Franny and Zooey not just as one about religious crisis, which I think is the way that a lot of people think about it, but in terms of always remembering that Buddy Glass is looking at all of this as a love story. And when we think about the three pieces that we have studied, we have Banana Fish in the beginning in 1948. In many ways, that is a tragic and doomed love story that really, really speaks to me, even though, the two parties are separate and are obviously at the tail end of their marriage. There is a kind of devotion. You have to look for it, but I really do believe it is there. Then with Franny, we obviously have this kind of failed love story between Lane and Franny, but it's very interesting to see what it is she is searching for and what his priorities are. And then once everybody is in the home, once we have Bessie, Franny, Zooey, and Buddy a little bit, writing the letter from New Hampshire, and then also in the phone call, which does in fact turn out to be Zooey and not Buddy. But we have the presence of all of these people returning home, and there is an enormous amount of love, enormous amount of concern and care among these people in this final piece of fiction that we are looking at. And then at the close of this author's introduction, we have Buddy saying this: "The youngest Glass boy will be seen reading an exceedingly lengthy letter, which will be reprinted here in full, I can safely promise, sent to him by his eldest living brother, Buddy Glass." Obviously, the living brother there is just like a gut punch, for those of us who have recently read Banana Fish. "The style of the letter, I'm told, bears a considerably more than passing resemblance to the style, or written mannerisms, of this narrator, and the general reader will no doubt jump to the heady conclusion that the writer of the letter and I are one and the same person. Jump he will, and I'm afraid jump he should." I love running into these instances in the past of when like he is the default, because it seems so weird to me. It sounds so odd. It really should be jump they will and jump they should. I just really appreciate the fact that we have really come a long way with our pronouns. "We will, however, leave this Buddy Glass in the third person from here on in. At least, I see no good reason to take him out of it." Again, I'm a sucker for the meta. I really enjoy, when an author in a piece of fiction who is, an author who is also the narrator is talking about whether or not he is in the first or third person. Then we have this very important space break. Salinger uses space breaks really well, very much. Gosh, iMovie keeps popping off, people. iMovie, I'm getting the balloons, I'm getting the thumbs up, I'm getting all sorts of things from iMovie very early in the morning here. So we have this space break, and then, in fact, Buddy is shifting into the third person. 10:30 on a Monday morning in November of 1955, Zooey Glass, a young man of 25, was seated in a very full bath reading a 4-year-old letter. So we have, again, this kind of, it's almost like stage direction. In fact, that feels very much like stage direction. It also should be reminiscent of Lane reading the letter from Franny at the very beginning of Franny. And it's important to note right from the start here that there's a huge amount of vulnerability. We have someone who is in the bath. He is naked, really stripped down in lots of ways. And he's reading something, this letter that he obviously has been keeping for many years. So it is obviously very important. So as the reader, you're expecting big things because, in fact, you have this idea of him being naked, being very vulnerable, and also engaging in something that is intimate and mysterious that, of course, you hope that he will share with us. We're then going to move to page 71 in my edition here, which is where we have the next space break. So we have Zooey in the bath and we have him reading the letter, which of course, dips us back into Buddy's first person voice. But then we have a space break. And once Bessie enters, once the mother enters, I was going to do a whole thing about mothers, which would have been so interesting with Muriel's mother and with Bessie. But honestly, there just is too much goodness. There's too much stuff to talk about and we cannot squash it all in. But we do, in fact, when Bessie arrives, we have another space break. We have her arrive, and things shift a little bit, where essentially Buddy is really receding and moving further away. So we have this: Zoe's reading was suddenly interrupted by his mother's voice, importunate, quasi-constructive, addressing him from outside the bathroom door. "Zooey, are you still in the tub?" And then, of course, I love this. We have Bessie coming in and sitting on the toilet. And, again, this is this very intimate thing between a mother and a son. He's like, Bessie, what are you doing in here? Get the hell out, all this kind of stuff. But in fact, his protestations, I mean, in some ways, he does want his privacy, but there also is a sense of really understanding why she is there. And the reason, of course, Bessie is there and is, bothering her youngest son while he is taking his bath is that, in fact, she is very concerned about Franny. We're going to skip to the next part where we have a space break. This is on page 118. And here we have this. The Glass's living room was about as unready to have its walls repainted as a room can be. Franny Glass lay asleep on the couch with an afghan over her. The wall-to-wall carpet had been neither taken up nor folded in at the borders, and the furniture, seemingly a small warehouse of it, was in its usual static dynamic distribution. So this is bringing up a whole vein, which unfortunately we are not going to be able to tap, which is all of the symbolism of the house. So any reader who is careful, whenever you come across a house or a room, you should take a step back and wonder what it is symbolizing. So in this case, we have this apartment that in many ways is this kind of archaeological site, and we have lots and lots of artifacts that are brought up and described very carefully in some ways by Salinger, certainly compared to the spareness of A Perfect Day for Banana Fish and the spareness of Franny. We really have this space that is sort of teeming with all of these artifacts. And it's very appropriate in many ways because the Glass family is a family that is very much stuck in the past. So very famously, and I'm sure all of you readers remember, the Glass children, one by one, were all part of a radio show called It's a Wise Child. This, of course, speaks to, this whole cult of the youth with Salinger and this idea of youths as being, in fact, very close to God and close to nature and having this wisdom that, in fact, is corrupted out of them by society. And as they get older, essentially, they lose this kind of wisdom, or in fact, they die, which 2 of the 7 Glass children do. But we also have this idea of, it's a wise child. We are not ever treated really to the sorts of questions that these children are answering, but there is this really sort of anti-education bent in all of Salinger. So you get the sense that these young children who are answering these questions, it's not like who's a smart child or who's the smartest kid. The name of the program is It's a Wise Child. So you have this idea of these children as being wise when they are young and then having all sorts of things befall them, namely the Second World War. I mean, it wreaks havoc through the entire family. And so this idea of their home as being this kind of repository is very important. Notably, the kids are on a radio show, so there isn't anything that they can sort of hold on to. Also notably, their parents are former vaudeville actors. So you have this idea of performance on the part of many people in the family, and the wall is covered with these photographs of all of these people who essentially are very ghost-like in many ways. But maybe the most symbolic thing is that the whole apartment is meant to be painted. Obviously, when you have a renovation of a space like this, it is speaking of, updating a space. It's speaking of, obliterating some of the past, even if that is just the stain of the root beer that Zooey once squirted out of a squirt gun onto the ceiling. So there are all of these different things that are meant to be covered over by this painting. And we see this idea of the chaos that is wrought on the apartment by the idea of these painters coming in and making everything new. It's something that everyone in the family is resisting. Also very important, of course, is that we have Franny. She is still lying prostrate, on this bed, very much like we last saw her. I really like the idea, too, that Franny Glass is mentioned. Again, we have this kind of distance of the narrator who is describing these things in a very sort of stage direction kind of way. But it's also important to embed Franny very clearly in the Glass family. So now that we have set the scene and given a little context by having read the beginnings of many of these sections, I want to take a closer look at the religious crisis because, in fact, it will give us some indications of some of the really important moments in the story and an excuse to read some of this beautiful prose, and it gives us a very good way to look at the ending of the novella. It's really perfect, in fact, that we have this beginning, this author's introduction on the part of Buddy, because it really does give us the roots of this religious crisis that Franny suffered in Franny and is continuing to suffer in Zooey. So this is Buddy talking about the way that he and Seymour, so the 2 of them were kind of like a pair. They were the eldest of the Glass children, and they're significantly older than the youngest 2. So you have the pairs, the 2 older pairs, I believe 3 in the middle, and then the 2 younger ones. So So Buddy really talks right at the beginning very openly about the fact that he and Seymour had this whole kind of method with which they wanted to essentially raise the youngest two. On page 65 of my edition, we have this. And this is actually in the letter that Buddy is writing to Zooey. And he's speaking about himself and Seymour. We knew there was no keeping a born scholar ignorant, and at heart, I think, we didn't really want to. But we were nervous, even frightened, at the statistics on child pedants and academic Weisenheimers who grow up into faculty recreation room savants. Which is, of course, important. This is this intellectual bent. It's also ironic because, in fact, Buddy has grown up to be, exactly that. He's both in academia and sort of out of it because he's resisting the idea of really sort of diving in to organized upper education. Much, much more important, though, Seymour had already begun to believe, and I agreed with him as far as I was able to see the point, that education by any name would smell as sweet, and maybe much sweeter, if it didn't begin with a quest for knowledge at all, but with a quest, as Zen would put it, for no knowledge. So you'll recall that the beginning of Franny and Zooey is that Zen koan, the idea about what does it sound like when one hand is clapping. So this idea of no knowledge is obviously very important. It's really pointing to this idea of the kind of enlightenment that Buddy and Seymour were trying to imbue in these younger children. And in some ways, if you step back and think about the war and think of Salinger in general, the experiences that he endured would in some ways make you want to seek something higher. I mean, knowledge and academia would become sort of frivolous in the face of having, denazified a lot of Germany during the Second World War. So this idea of transcendence, this idea of spirituality, this idea of, oneness with God and essentially being in the moment and not thinking about the past or the future, it would be very tempting and, in fact, very salient for someone like Salinger. So a little further down, we thought it would be wonderfully constructive to at least, that is, if our own limitations got in the way, tell you as much as we knew about the men, the saints, the arhats, the bodhisattvas, the jivamuktas, who knew something or everything about this state of being. That is, we wanted you both to know who and what Jesus and Gautama and Lao Tse and Shankaracharya and Wineng and Sri Ramakrishna, some of these names are not ones that I know well, etc., to know who they were before you knew too much or anything about Homer or Shakespeare or even Blake or Whitman, let alone George Washington and his cherry tree or the definition of a peninsula or how to parse a sentence. That, anyway, was the big idea. So we have this idea here, that these two older brothers who were having religious crises in some ways of their own, how they wanted, in fact, to educate these two younger children to sort of look beyond knowledge toward some sort of enlightenment. So here are the roots of the crisis that Franny is facing when she is in college. Then we're going to skip all the way to page 148. So this is when Zooey and Franny are having their conversation. Zooey has gotten out of the bath finally. He stopped talking to his mother. And he's essentially criticizing her for, maybe wanting some sort of self-aggrandizement out of saying the Jesus prayer. And she, of course, is saying that she knows, in fact, and that she feels very bad about any kind of self-aggrandizement. So on 148, Zooey says, "All right, take it easy, take it easy." "I can't take it easy. You make me so mad. What do you think I'm doing here in this crazy room, losing weight like mad, worrying Bessie and Les absolutely silly, upsetting the house and everything? Don't you think I have sense enough to worry about my motives for saying the prayer? That's exactly what's bothering me so. Just because I'm choosy about what I want, in this case, enlightenment or peace, instead of money or prestige or fame or any of those things, doesn't mean I'm not as egotistical and self-seeking as everybody else. If anything, I'm more so. I don't need the famous Zachary Glass to tell me that." Here there was a marked break in her voice, and she began to be very attentive to Bloomberg again. Tears, presumably, were imminent, if not already on the way. Bloomberg is the cat. But here we have this idea that, what she wants is enlightenment and peace, but she's very concerned about her motives. I really was interested in this idea of tears, presumably, there's one of our famous adverbs, were imminent, if not already on the way. I was like, what is the difference between imminent and already on the way? It was a little confusing to me. But I think maybe imminent means like not quite on the way. which this is a kind of thing, Salinger is always talking about being anti-intellectual, but occasionally we have these kind of things. Maybe it's meant to be kind of a cone, this idea of like how is imminent different from on the way. Maybe that's the way we're supposed to read it, as something that is illogical, a type of no knowledge. But also part of me was like, wait, this feels like an intellectual kind of word play that is really tailor-made for someone like me who is in fact deeply invested in academia and knowledge and literature. So here, once we have had this kind of explanation of what the crisis in many ways is for Franny, we are going to have this beautiful part where essentially Zooey is going to loop Buddy into the whole thing, which is so nice because we don't want the first part where Buddy is introducing himself and then the letter. That part all feels a little disconnected. So what we want here, and it is delivered to us very beautifully, is this idea of connecting how Buddy fits into this whole thing. This is the narrator talking about Zooey. Then, almost forcibly, he looked over at Franny again. "Do you want me to try to get Buddy on the phone for you tonight?" he asked. "I think you should talk to somebody. I'm no damn good for this." He waited, looking at her steadily. "Franny, what about it?" Franny's head was bowed. She appeared to be searching for fleas in Bloomberg's coat, her fingers very busy indeed, turning back tufts of fur. She was in fact crying now, but in a very local sort of way, as it were. There were tears, but no sounds. Zooey watched her for a full minute or so, then said, not precisely kindly, but without importuning, "Franny, what about it? Shall I try to get Buddy on the phone?" She shook her head without raising it. She went on searching for fleas. Then, after an interval, she did reply to Zooey's question, but not very audibly. "What?" Zooey asked. Franny repeated her statement. "I want to talk to Seymour." Guys, I'm practically tearing up right here. I have written it in the marginalia. Ugh. This is that kind of echo of A Perfect Day for Banana Fish and also of Franny that is just absolutely devastating in some ways. This idea of not being able to communicate with someone who was so formative for you is clearly very difficult for her, and would be very difficult for Zooey because, of course, he also misses Seymour and Buddy also misses Seymour. And it's important to think about the fact that for all of them, the eldest brother, who was in many ways, their sort of mystical guide, this is someone who committed suicide when he was in his 20s. So you have this sense of the guide, of the guru, as being kind of lost. And in fact, in many ways, Seymour, throughout all of these works, is this kind of Jesus figure. He is someone who has kind of ascended in some ways, but in many ways, he is just as inscrutable as Jesus. So it's a very deep and very sad moment, especially for someone who has recently read Franny and A Perfect Day for Banana Fish. It's really important to note that this last part of the interaction between Franny and Zooey is happening over the telephone. So if we think of Banana Fish and the idea of Muriel trying to place this call and these long distance lines, and then we move all the way to Zooey, which was 9 years later, we have this idea of this telephone in the room that Buddy and Seymour used to share. And in fact, Buddy is very explicit about the idea that he doesn't want to get rid of the telephone because he really likes seeing Seymour's name in the phone book. We also get the sense that this phone that used to be Seymour's telephone is this idea. I mean, you almost can feel it as a reader. It's like the one way that we might, in fact, be able to talk to Seymour, this idea that we might be able to pick up the telephone and call him. So we also have the idea, of course, that Buddy, who does not have a telephone up in New Hampshire, in order to talk to him, it would require like calling a neighbor and getting him to come to the neighbor's house. But we have this idea that Buddy and Seymour are kind of one and the same. And in fact, that Seymour is very much like this Christ figure. So at the end, we have Zooey, with a handkerchief on his head, which was so interesting to me. It made me think, in fact, of Lane's handkerchief in Franny. He offers it for Franny's sweat, and she says she can't get it all perspiry because she loves the handkerchief. And of course, the way that she is sweating in Franny is very much the way that Zooey is sweating in Zooey. So there are all these parallels. Unfortunately, we're not going to get into all of them. But it's very important because at the end of the story, in order to pretend to be Buddy, Zooey essentially makes himself go into the room of his older brothers, which is kind of like this crypt that no one has been in a long time, and it is exactly the way that it was when his older brothers lived there, Seymour, of course, now being dead. And he decides he's going to call, in fact, from Seymour and Buddy's room inside the apartment. He's going to call the apartment itself, and he's going to get Franny on the phone and essentially pretend to be Buddy. It's very important that when Franny makes her way down the hallway to the telephone, she enters her parents' room, and her parents' room is very much like the hotel room in A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, except for the fact that their bedroom is one of the spaces that is about to be painted. So everything is pulled off the walls. It is, in fact, ready for renewal, which is extremely important. If Muriel in A Perfect Day for Banana Fish was essentially making that hotel room, trying to make it into a domestic space, and it is, in fact, going to resist that because it is a hotel, and far more importantly, it is a space where her husband is going to take his life. Here we have a domestic space. It is, in fact, a very intimate domestic space. It is her parents' bedroom, and she enters into it in this kind of regressed state. She's wearing her slippers and she's wearing a little robe, and she seems very childlike in many ways. She enters into the one space in the apartment that in fact is ready for renewal. It is the one that is ready to be repainted. So she moves into that space and in fact engages in some real communication, not in fact with Buddy, and she realizes fairly quickly that it is not in fact Buddy, but in fact Zooey. But it is still extremely important that she is able to make this kind of communication with any of her brothers. And in fact, Zooey essentially acts as a kind of medium, in part because he has just been reading the letter from Buddy and is able, in fact, to remind her of these very important pieces in this last kind of monologue at the end of the book-length piece of fiction. So many of you who have listened to the Fox page for a long time know that I have a terrible memory. I really, it's sort of shocking to me, in fact, how little I remember. And I will say that the thing that I remember most clearly from Franny and Zooey, aside from, I have this kind of image of Franny and Lane, in the restaurant together, smoking with their martinis, during college and eating the frog legs and the salad. But the other thing that I remember very clearly is the idea of this fat lady. And of course, we have this idea, that kind of well-worn trope about, it's not over until the fat lady sings. So I think in my mind, part of the reason why it is memorable is because I also have that other thing in my head. But it's very important because this is not just, it's not over until the fat lady sings. In fact, it's a very different idea of the fat lady. So at the very end of the story, Zooey is telling a little tale of his own about how when he was very young and was on It's a Wise Child, that Seymour wanted him to shine his shoes, even though his shoes were not visible to anyone. Again, remember, they are on the radio. And essentially, what Seymour is insisting on is this idea of shining your shoes for someone, even though they don't know you're doing it. This idea of service and this idea of respect for someone else and this idea of compassion, even when it goes totally unnoticed. So at the end, we have this beautiful close to this novella where the idea of this fat lady, this idea of sort of serving other people, even if you don't know them, and even if they are not aware of the energy that you are sending out into the universe, that is very important. So on page 200 at the very end, I'm just going to go ahead and read this last page. Significantly, as I mentioned yesterday, throughout all of Zooey, he's using the sort of the nickname Buddy, not for his older brother, but in fact for his mother and for his sister. So you have this idea of Zooey, over and over saying, "Hey, Buddy, Buddy, do this, Buddy, don't do that." It's so sad in many ways because he is sort of evoking this older brother who he has not talked to, and he's looking at this 4-year-old letter. I mean, there's a real failure of communication between Zooey and Buddy, and certainly there's a failure of communication between any of the Glass children and Seymour, but I think in many ways Buddy is a stand-in for Seymour and is also not really available for communication. So at the end, Zooey says this: "Let me tell you something now, Buddy. Are you listening?" Franny, looking extremely tense, nodded. "I'll tell you a terrible secret. Are you listening to me? There isn't anyone out there who isn't Seymour's fat lady. That includes your Professor Tupper, Buddy, and all his goddamn cousins by the dozens. There isn't anyone that isn't Seymour's fat lady. Don't you know that? Don't you know that goddamn secret yet? And don't you know, listen to me now, don't you know who that fat lady really is? Ah, Buddy, it's Christ himself, Buddy." For joy, apparently, it was all Franny could do to hold the phone even with both hands. For a foolish half-minute or so, there were no other words, no further speech. Then, "I can't talk anymore, Buddy." The sound of a phone being replaced in its catch followed. Franny took in her breath slightly, but continued to hold the phone to her ear. A dial tone, of course, followed the formal break in the connection. She appeared to find it extraordinarily beautiful to listen to, rather as if it were the best possible substitute for the primordial silence itself. But she seemed to know too when to stop listening to it, as if all of what little or much wisdom there is in the world were suddenly hers. When she had replaced the phone, she seemed to know just what to do next, too. She cleared away the smoking things, then drew back the cotton bedspread from the bed she had been sitting on, took off her slippers, and got into the bed. For some minutes before she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, she just lay quiet, smiling at the ceiling. It's so beautiful. It's such a beautiful ending, and it's so satisfying to have read Franny beforehand. And at the end of Franny, we see her lying, speaking the Jesus prayer. So we have the idea of her crisis then, and the idea finally at the end of Zooey that she does have some sort of peace, that she can be at peace. It's just an absolutely beautiful ending. My temptation is to really dive deeply into this incredibly beautiful ending, but I'm not going to do that. The one thing that I will say, it was a little bit jarring for me when he says, in fact, don't you know who the fat lady is? I mean, this idea that the fat lady is everyone makes perfect sense to me. She's very critical and very sort of anti-educational in Franny. And then later in Zooey, she's very critical of her professors and, is sort of tearing everyone down who is an intellectual. And in fact, Zooey is essentially saying you need to remember that we need to be compassionate, and we need to remember that everyone deserves our compassion and that we should not, in fact, be so judgy. And here at the very end, he essentially is saying that this person who needs to sort of stand in for all people and everyone who deserves our compassion is, in fact, Christ. So I was a little off put by that because I was a little bit like, like what if we don't believe in Jesus Christ? But it's very important to think of Jesus Christ in the end as someone who is situated in this story. So, one of the ways to think about Jesus Christ is that he is listed in the beginning when Buddy is sort of detailing their program for their younger siblings. Jesus Christ was one of these many adepts. He was just like Paramahansa Yogananda, although he's not mentioned there, but he's just like all of these different wise men. So I think Jesus can be seen as sort of one of these wise men. But more importantly, I really do believe that we are meant to see Jesus as a kind of stand-in for Seymour, or vice versa. We can see Seymour as a stand-in. So Seymour is someone who, was unable to stay on this terrestrial Earth because, in fact, he was so damaged by the Second World War. And also, you could argue, in fact, that none of the glass children is going to be happy and is going to settle well into their adulthood because, in fact, they are all most comfortable and most sort of vibrant and most alive when they are young children because they are closer to wisdom and enlightenment, given the scheme of the Glass family. So the piece about Christ is important there, but it's also so beautiful at the end to have this sense of Franny at peace, and also the sense of Zooey as having done what he needed to do. At the end of Franny, the short story, we have this kind of unsettled feeling that like we don't know what's going to happen, but we're leaving her in a state of crisis. And I really, really appreciate the fact that at the end of Zooey, we do have everything kind of coming together in a way that's very satisfying and really very beautiful. We are going to close by very, very briefly looking at why I think this piece of work and why all of Salinger has such enduring appeal. I will say right from the top that Salinger's is a very uneven oeuvre. There is a lot of work, particularly in 9 stories, that I do not think is that great. I have read these stories over and over, all of them, because I keep thinking maybe some of them will get better. I'm not wild about Teddy. I'm not wild about de Daumier's Blue Period, or whatever that one is. But some of this prose is so incredibly, incredibly good that I do believe it sort of deserves the enduring qualities it seems to have. So part of it is simply this highly stylized prose. We've got this distanced third-person narrator, for the most part, who really has this very identifiable, unique, unusual voice. Everything sounds a bit like stage direction, so you have this distance, but you also have this kind of hyperbolic thing where, there are lots of adverbs and everything is very extreme. I would argue in many ways that the sort of spare nature of the prose, the kind of stripped down feeling, is sort of deceiving because what seems simple is in fact very complex. So if you look at any detail that Salinger is offering up, it's extremely important. All of them are very, very telling. Even the adverbs, the adjectives, everything, every single word is load bearing. We also have just absolutely inimitable, incredible world-class dialogue. I love the use of italics here. I mean, Salinger is one of the few people that can get away with all of the italics and all of the convoluted sentences and all of the adverbs. So, in some ways, the writing is very stripped down and very spare. In other ways, it's really complex and complicated. And one of the ways that we see him shine, I think, most brightly, is in his use of dialogue. So that's the stylized, this very stylized, identifiable, shape that he has to his prose. But we also, I think, are drawn to this kind of very rarefied, very urbane and very, in some ways, very sophisticated and, enlightened and very, sort of wise group of people. There is a precocity and sort of like a preciousness to it that I think could be off putting, but I always find it so incredibly appealing. It's like I almost want to be off put by it, and I'm always sucked in. We also, this cult of youth, which is like not maybe a great thing once you're 54, but for some reason it is so appealing to just look back. I mean, it is astonishing to think of how young all of these people are. They're, sort of in their 20s. You look at Muriel, you look at Seymour. I mean, these are people who've had considerable experience, namely the Second World War, but their youth is something, I mean, partially because it ends up feeling a little bit nostalgic, but it is a very salient and I think a very appealing aspect to the writing. It's also very important that what we have here is a family. So the Glass family, all of these sort of young people, Bessie and Les are sort of superfluous in many ways. In some ways, they're foundational. In some ways, they're kind of superfluous. But the idea of this family and the cohesion and the closeness of the siblings is so appealing. It's also really interesting to look at this family of 7 children. It's always interesting, I think, to sort of, get the inside scoop on such a large family, and certainly one where the siblings are so close and so precocious and so wise and so verbal. In some ways, it's just so appealing to dive into this family and to learn about them from all of these different perspectives, given all of the different pieces of fiction. In many ways, too, this is a group, this family group is also very vulnerable. So these are people who are, again, having gone through really harrowing experiences. And some of them are very large, like Seymour's suicide in A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, but some of them are very small. One of my favorite pieces is down at the dinghy, where we have Boo Boo Glass and her son, and there is an instance of anti Semitism in that story that is very small in some ways, but is so deeply affecting. So we have, again, this idea of the family as being explored through all of these different pieces of fiction. And we have vulnerabilities both on the large scale, this idea of taking someone's life, all the way down, to a small incident that feels, in fact, very large to a young boy. We also, of course, have the trauma of the Second World War. I mean, I would argue that in some ways, the mining of that trauma by Salinger is one of the most important. And in some ways, it's kind of the most shrouded. I mean, it's not really shrouded, but it is one of the things that is foundational, but is sort of unseen in lots of ways throughout the work. I will also say that there is this kind of precocity and there is this kind of vulnerability, which are different sort of things. But there's also this incredible cynicism. So we are seeing, certainly with Holden Caulfield and with lots of the other characters, we have this kind of anti-elitist, anti-materialistic approach to life, really cynical in lots of ways. And that is one, in fact, that I really appreciate. This is, someone who in some ways is asking very large questions and is holding up, some very important sort of values, but at the same time is really stripping away and is really asking some very sort of cynical questions about how Americans and how all people operate. The last thing I will say about the enduring appeal of all of these works is that there is a sense that Salinger is asking these very large questions. I mean, some people, I think, especially given his own personal religious trajectory, are a little dismissive of the idea of the spiritual quest as manifest in the fiction. But I would argue that asking these big, big questions, whether it is about wisdom or whether it is about enlightenment or whether it is about the ability of people to communicate, they're really large fundamental questions, and he really digs into them in all sorts of different ways through all of the different pieces of fiction. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me. This was such an absolute delight. I really enjoyed this succession of pieces of fiction, and I'm really coming away with a sense of having really understood more deeply, but also having just really enjoyed immersing myself in this prose. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.